Welcome everyone to Fireside Chat. ESG, Impact, B-corp, what's the difference? I'm Nisha Sridhar, Marketing and Events Manager, and it's great to see you all here today. It's with gratitude and respect that we acknowledge the lands on which Foresight operates are the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And for myself, I'm speaking to you from Calgary, which is within the Treaty 7 territory. These are the traditional lands of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Guinai, and Piikani First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and Stoney Nakoda First Nation. Here is the agenda for the day. We have an experienced panel here. We will have panel introductions and a moderated Q&A. Thank you for those who submitted your questions before the session. At any time over the next hour, please use the Q&A option to post your questions. This session is being recorded and you will receive the recording in the next few days. Before we start, I want to say a few words about Foresight. Foresight is Canada's clean tech accelerator, and our goal is to make Canada the first G7 country to reach net zero. We work tirelessly to position Canada as a global leader in clean technology. We bring together clean tech innovators, industry partners, investors, government, and academia to address today's most urgent climate issues and support a global transition to a green economy. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists today, Jennifer Hutcheon, Vice President of Vancity Community Investment Bank, Connor Chell, Head of ESG Practice Group, MLT Aikens, and James Shapaya from Foresight, who will be moderating this session. Let's start with Jennifer Hutcheon. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you. Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to join the conversation today. My name is Jennifer Hutcheon, and I'm Vice President at BCIB, where I lead the bank's growth strategy. We are a Canadian commercial bank with a strong focus on values-based lending solutions that support both social purpose real estate and climate finance. And as a federally regulated bank, BCIB serves clients all across Canada, although much of our business right now is currently in Ontario. And we are part of the broader Vancity Group, which is based out of Vancouver. And you may know Vancity as Canada's largest community credit union and was founded in 1946. At Vancity, we really believe that financial institutions have a critical role to play in addressing the climate crisis and in particular the clean energy transition. And why is this? It's because financial institutions really have a hand in deciding where the money goes. The shift to a clean economy will really require innovative business models and massive capital investments. And finance, of course, is critical to this growth. So at VCIB, we're very much focused on financing social purpose real estate to help alleviate the housing crisis, as well as financing Canada's transition to a low carbon economy through our climate finance team. And because we're a values-driven business, it really made an obvious step for us to certify as a B-corp in 2018. And I look forward to explaining what that means to you further.
Thank you, Jennifer. And over to you, Connor.
Thanks very much, and good morning, everyone. My name is Connor Chell. I am the head of the ESG practice group for MLT Aikens. For those of you that aren't familiar, we're a regional law firm operating predominantly in Western Canada, but we have clients across Canada as well. And before I get into a little bit more about the firm and myself, just a quick note off the top. We're a big fan of Vancity. We've been following their progress over the last number of years. We think of them as a thought leader in the financial institution space, particularly as it comes to ESG. So very excited to be on this panel here today with Jennifer. And also in terms of Foresight, we do actually have a formal partnership with Foresight and helping them advance their goals towards net zero as well. In terms of the firm itself, as I say, we're a full service commercial law firm. I'm the head of the ESG practice group. Although we are a law firm, we take a slightly different approach in terms of multidisciplinary services that we provide. We have professional civil environmental engineers that work on our team, as well as audit and assurance professionals, Indigenous professionals as well. So we try to cover as broad of a scope as we can from an ESG perspective. For those that are familiar with the ESG world, you'll know that there is quite a breadth in terms of topics and expertise that are required. So we're effectively trying to be a one-stop shop for all things ESG. And for those things that we recognize we can't do, we've developed a number of channel partnerships with complementary and like-minded service providers. So about myself, a little bit of background. I'm an environmental and regulatory lawyer by trade. I've worked with a number of industries. I'm located in Calgary, as I said. So we do a fair bit of work on the energy side in terms of conventional energy as well as renewable and alternative energy sources. We also do a great deal of work with mining, agriculture, financial services, and Indigenous businesses, among others. So maybe I'll just leave it there. Thanks very much for having me and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Connor. Over to you, James, and he will also be moderating this session.
Thanks, Nisha, and thanks, Connor and Jennifer, for joining us today. ESG and B-corps, you hear about all of these things, and the reason we wanted to address this formally and get some more information out there to you is because you're going to be faced with this. You're going to be faced with this from an investor's perspective. You're going to be faced with it from market. Is this a passing fad? What is actually going on? And given that when we look at, according to Bloomberg, under ESG, there's now scheduled to be about $53 trillion of assets under management related to respect to ESG. So this is not a passing fad. This is a major class and something very important to look at. For those that are joining us today, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and we will try and address them in this call. We will also provide contact information for those that are on the panel that hopefully if we don't get to it, you can still actually reach them and get your questions answered. I think what we want to do now is really start with, Jennifer, you had mentioned VetCity as a B Corp. Could you tell what is a B Corp? What's going on in this? Please give us some background.
Sure. So when we certified as a B Corp in 2018, we joined a global community of companies. And these are all companies that use business as a force for good. In order to achieve this kind of designation, a company's entire social and environmental impact is measured under B Lab's rigorous standards. And so what you'll find is that B Corps are really mission-driven companies that are balancing both purpose and profit. They're companies that consider additional stakeholders, they consider morals or missions in addition to making a profit. And once you are certified as a B Corp, you do have to recertify every 3 years. And this ensures that companies continue to meet these rigorous standards year after year that make them worthy of obtaining B Corp status. There's quite a number of recognizable B Corps that you might be familiar with, such as Patagonia, Ben & Jerry's, Tom's, and Nespresso. And I believe Business Development Bank of Canada is also a certified B Corp.
Thanks, Jennifer. We'll get into what it actually means to you in a second, but what I'd like to get from Connor is, can you actually help us understand what is ESG and what's the relationship between ESG and B Corps?
Yeah, great question, James, and one that we get fairly frequently. I'd say over the last number of years, people are becoming more familiar with the term ESG, but typically we'll start, if you've heard of sustainability generally or corporate social responsibility, those were kind of the precursors to what we're seeing in ESG now today. ESG stands for environmental, social, and corporate governance. And there are no actual defined or exhaustive list of topics that fall within each one of those buckets, although there is mandatory climate-related financial disclosure that is coming into effect in Canada and many other jurisdictions, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But in terms of ESG itself, on the environmental side of things, the easy way to think about that is anything that your organization does that impacts the natural world. So some of the big topics that fall within the environmental category, climate change and GHG emissions, I would say, historically today and well into the future is and has been the largest topic that's relevant to nearly every organization. So that's a big one. We're seeing the evolution, I guess you could say, or the increasing prominence of a number of other factors. Biodiversity is one. There's the task force on nature-related financial disclosure, which we think will become mandatory at some point in the future here as well. Waste and water use also are very important on the environmental side. And as I say, that's not exhaustive. There's a dozen or so or more topics that may be important and material depending on the nature of your organization and the industry in which you operate. On the social side of things, that's how your organization deals with people and communities. So that's internal and external to your organization. So a few of the big items there. The number one that we always talk about is that of Indigenous relations and engagement. You may see the acronym sometimes spelled out as ESGI or IESG, I representing the Indigenous. Obviously in Canada, with truth and reconciliation, Indigenous relations and engagement is a huge topic, something that's incredibly important. So always make sure to mention that one. And another one that's really important on the social side that you've often heard about, I'm sure, is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And ethical supply chains, I guess, would be the other one that I would mention. There are, again, mandatory reporting requirements relative to modern slavery, which is forced and child labor, that's coming into effect here in Canada, as well as, again, a number of other jurisdictions around the world. On the governance side of things, that's how well your organization is managed. So one of the big topics there is board composition. That's a big deal, as well as things like whistleblower complaints, how your company is dealing with that, anti-corruption, anti-bribery. Those are a few topics or examples that people are fairly familiar with. And then to the second part of your question, how does ESG tie in with B Corp certification? As Jennifer touched on already, there is very rigorous criteria that's required in order to stay certified as a B Corp. So, the way we typically see it is the certification is a great thing to have, especially when you're faced with, things like mandatory reporting. I think that companies that are already well on their way from a B Corp journey perspective are in a good position to start reporting out on ESG as those requirements become increasingly mandatory.
Thanks, Connor. Jennifer, so why did Vancity actually go down that path? Why did you choose to go down the B Corp path? What was the drivers? And given the amount of effort that's associated with it, obviously it's not a simple process. So that obviously had to be taken into consideration as you're doing this. So what brings you to that point?
Yeah, absolutely. It is rigorous, and it's really driven, I think, by the way we view our business as being very values driven. And so, because we're really guided by that original commitment to people and planet, it was sort of the next logical step for us to certify. And it is an important aspect of our impact work, but at the end of the day, it's not the ultimate driver. The real driver is that we've embedded impact on people and planet into the very core of the business model. And so while it's great that we're certified, it's really about how we conduct our business every day. And what that means for us really is that every business decision we take, every operational decision, hiring decision, procurement decision, always has an impact lens alongside the profit lens. And it's kind of part of the core values of Vancity overall and the bank that as much as we are profitable, we don't strive to maximize profit at any cost. We've realized that making a profit and having a positive impact, is not mutually exclusive. And so really for us, that focus on that triple bottom line, again, the people, planet, and profit, that's really what drives and allows us to make the real impact. Is sort of the stamp on that mission that we take on every day.
Thanks, Jen. Kind of going to continue on that. I hear B Corp certification, B Corp, C Corp. Are we talking legal, something legally set up, or is this different? And I think that's where a lot of people have some struggles with it. Is there a fundamental difference between a C Corp and a B Corp? And is it B Corp separate legal entity, or is it actually a certification process?
Yeah, so good question. So the B Corp designation is a certification at the moment. I'll talk a little bit more about the mandatory reporting requirements that are legal requirements. But that is a question that we often get. There are other jurisdictions where B Corp certification or different types of corporations, actually you would change the articles of incorporation to reflect that you are a B Corp. But so far in Canada, that's not the case. So it isn't a separate mandatory legal reporting requirement. But as I mentioned earlier, it is a step certainly in the right direction, and it's a big step in the right direction for organizations that are looking to prepare for these incoming mandatory reporting requirements, because as we say, there's a number of things that you need to collect and be aware of. Data is a huge thing when it comes to reporting, and the volume of data that's required to become a B Corp is quite significant. So it certainly gets you, well on your way to preparing for those mandatory reporting requirements.
So, Jennifer, on that, how do you then, with all that reporting requirements, how do you actually integrate that into your business strategy so that, obviously you have to be looking after your owners, your shareholders, and you're layering this on top of it. How does that actually look from a management perspective as you're setting your strategies and so forth?
Yeah, it's interesting because, really Vancity as an entity has been focused on impact long before, ESG became so popular. And it's, really important as a risk framework, but again, it comes back to, it's not necessarily the driver of impact for us. So it really comes back to that triple bottom line. We have, defined what that means for our organization. We have guidelines around it. We have methodology and on how to track and report on these different metrics. So we've been evolving that for over a decade now. And, it allows us to track and really communicate to the public and to our board the proportion of different assets, including retail loans, business loans, investments, that support different specific areas of impact, such as affordable buildings, sustainable green buildings, and underserved people and communities. And so, really the fact that we're leading with our values and making decisions, and as I said earlier, like every decision is made with that guiding principle, and that really transcends the transactional day-to-day idea of bottom line growth. So, for example, how it might show up in a management decision would be when we're looking at prospective loans at the bank and looking at an opportunity to lend into a very strong creditworthy borrower, perhaps buying acquiring a piece of commercial real estate. We're looking at really what is the purpose of that real estate, what is its impact on the community, what's its benefit to the community. Is it providing affordable or even market housing to help solve the housing crisis? That's a yes for us. Is it not doing any of those things? Is it not a green building? Is it not, helping to solve the housing crisis? We actually pass on those opportunities. It doesn't really matter how lucrative it is or how strong it is from a credit perspective. If it doesn't fit those impact guidelines that we've set for ourselves as an organization, we will not do the transaction. And that's a very different approach. Having worked both in, private sector and public sector over many years, it's a very different approach to really make that impact consideration on each and every transaction that we look at from a lending perspective.
That's interesting because, Connor, I'm going to put that to you as far as now you're a CEO of a company and you're needing to raise capital and your investors are looking at the return on that investment. How do you see it impacting companies' ability to raise capital? If there's a profit motivation there, you could be actually, could it impact? How does it impact? Does it impact positively, negatively? Like it's an interesting new dynamic.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think, Jennifer touched on it and covered it fairly well. But, in terms of a few additional comments, it was alluded to earlier, banks, insurance companies, trust companies, they're all subject actually to the first round of mandatory reporting requirements here in Canada. The Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions released guideline B15, which all of those federally regulated financial institutions need to report out on. So Yeah, no, appreciating that many organizations still operate with, a profit motive, certainly. I think you're seeing an increasing demand, I suppose you could say, from a number of different stakeholders, including shareholders, but even broader than that, right? Like if you think that some of those that are making those financing or lending decisions are subject on the other side to mandatory regulatory requirements, you can bet your bottom dollar, pun intended, that they are going to be thinking very, very hard and trying to incorporate to the extent possible, those sorts of considerations, and those considerations being, what's required from a mandatory reporting perspective, in virtually every decision that they make. And that applies to financing, lending. We work with a number of insurance companies that are also working really hard on, detailed methodologies and assessment protocols for, how they're making their insurance decisions, right? So I wouldn't say that there's a direct correlation at the moment between, certain number of points on the financing side or, premium variations on the insurance side, but I think we're certainly headed in that direction. And, the other thing that I would mention in passing, organizations like Van City that take that broader perspective, like Jennifer has already touched on a number of issues that fall, into the social or governance category, I would say, beyond what you see from a mandatory environmental or climate related mandatory reporting perspective. I think if you look to jurisdictions like Europe, as an example, we're already seeing that expansion and evolution of mandatory reporting beyond those environmental factors that we're seeing, as kind of a first step here in Canada and North America.
Okay. Jennifer, how have you seen this impact Density's in gaining customers? How do you see customers responding to this? It's going to be a kind of an interesting thing because for some it'll be important, but how have you seen it as changing the nature of your relationships with your customers?
Yeah, I think becoming a B Corp has really sent a strong signal to our customers. Also to our our partners that we partner with in terms of different initiatives, and even more importantly, our employees. It's part of our employee value proposition, really, that we're committed to more than just profits, and we have a dedication to social and environmental responsibility. So I see it as a real benefit to the business. It sends that strong signal. And in particular with customers, I think it really does enhance. It can enhance your brand. It attracts like-minded customers, and absolutely has helped us in terms of attracting and retaining our top talent, who really want to work for a company that has more of a purpose than just making money.
Yeah, it's definitely is adding that, as you said, the triple bottom line. Connor, what are the real legal implications? I'm going to put the lawyer on the spot on this one. What are the implications with respect to this, both from a governance perspective, and we'll deal with how boards deal with it in a minute, but I'm looking at from a management's perspective and a corporate perspective, thoughts on the legal implications?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, on the climate-related financial disclosure side of things, what we're seeing is, we're moving away from this voluntary reporting framework into a mandatory, and the reporting that you're going to see is going to be more akin to securities regulated reporting. So you're going to have liability not only from a corporate perspective, but also potentially from a personal liability perspective. It's always been the case that directors and officers, have a duty of oversight, and they can't be, disclosing things that are misleading, particularly in the investment context. But what we're seeing is that actually explicitly outlined in a number of pieces of legislation. So, as an example, the Modern Slavery Bill S-211 legislation that's coming in, it explicitly mentions that there's $250,000 penalties for directors and officers in their personal capacity, as well as that corporate capacity. So I think, again, you're seeing an expansion, I guess, into some of those liability potentials for both the corporate actors as well as the board of directors that guide them.
Okay, so speaking of the boards, because obviously, and the part of their governance, they're going to have to be looking at that. Jennifer, how does Entity's board look at this and uh, make sure that it's having the right effects on the overall organization? And obviously, that governance is going to be really hard because they need to be looking at the data. Now, your experience, you've been doing this for years, so you know what the board's looking at. That's obviously going to be a challenge for some of the newer companies when they're looking at this thing. So give us some of your thoughts on the governance with respect to this.
Yeah, I think the whole concept of ESG as a risk framework is really a great tool for boards to be able to assess how environmental, social, governance risks might affect the company's financial performance. I think the challenge is, of course, the methodology to date has been kind of subjective and not standardized. And so I know that, one of the things I would look for is really something around very transparent reporting. So I think from the company's perspective, if you are very transparent with your reporting, that's an excellent way to demonstrate your commitment to ESG. I think adherence to, any accepted type of standards or some of the standards that we see coming out through newer legislation, really following through with goals that are set out around ESG and reporting back on them with tangible action and actual results is super important. I think you can also look at, objective type of third-party audits and assessments to help verify some of that data, because, honestly, there has been a lot of accusations of greenwashing of different companies that say they're going to do something and they don't follow through. And so that's something I would, really recommend everybody look towards, is that kind of transparent reporting, verification, follow through with action and results. And that's certainly something our board looks at when we're reporting to them what our results are every quarter.
Yeah, let's continue that on, because kind of obviously that greenwashing is a real risk with respect to management and the board, because obviously this whole area becomes a little bit politicized. And you'll have companies saying, they'll splash we're in compliance with all of this stuff, and then when you dig behind it, they're really not. And so from a board's perspective, you could have huge backlash associated with this if there isn't, to Jennifer's point, that transparency behind it, where you're actually doing it. And right now, you may have certain of these requirements, but auditing that portion of it, it's really not, it's still in its infancy. Would you not, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I agree with everything that Jennifer said. And maybe I'll just add a few points there. We often describe the transition that we're in the terms of two waves. So the first wave that we saw from an ESG reporting perspective was maybe over the last 15 to 20 years. And it was, under those voluntary frameworks. And it was also largely characterized by a promotional component, I think. Many companies used it as an opportunity for marketing and to tell a good news story, particularly from an environmental perspective. But what was really lacking there, and Jennifer put it well, was, that data credibility and reliability. So, as we move, and we've been calling, 2023 or 2024 potentially now, the year that everything changes from a reporting perspective, because instead of having that voluntary, promotional characterization of reporting, we're moving into a mandatory world, basically, where instead of promotion, there's going to be liability and enforcement. So with that, you need to be focusing on, the data credibility, the reliability of your data. It needs to really be financial grade reporting. And I agree with the transparency comments that Jennifer made. But the one thing I would add there is, transparency. I think you need to be doing a bit of an internal assessment as to, how credible the data that you've been reporting and collecting so far actually is. So I think there is that component as well. And, we also talked a little bit about greenwashing. And, I think some people are under the mistaken impression that greenwashing is always intentional. But, what I see is more so, and in more instances, it's actually quite unintentional. Lots of times you'll have a sustainability team, for example, within an organization, and they're just not given the appropriate resources or authority to actually get that information from their business. So as a result, the information and data that they've been collecting isn't as robust as it necessarily needs to be. And then, onto some of the things that Jennifer was talking about in terms of setting goals, there's that trickle down effect where if you don't have the right information, it's, garbage in, garbage out. So lots of goals, and particularly around net zero, we do caution clients. You need to be very sure that, what you're promising out in the public domain actually matches up with what you're able to do from an operational perspective. And I think over the next year or two, it'll be very interesting to see across a number of different industries how those sorts of commitments that were made in the voluntary world are going to change or be walked back when we get into the mandatory side of things. We've already seen a few examples of it. I know in Ontario, the Ontario Securities Commission, and here in Alberta, the Alberta Securities Commission are behind the scenes actively looking at those sorts of claims, particularly for public issuers. And we've seen a few examples where I suspect, I don't know this to be the case for sure, but I suspect that they've talked to a number of those organizations and said something to the effect of, hey, we noticed that your disclosure doesn't appear to be, as reliable as it's going to be required to be. So you have an option. You can either go out, and issue a press release, or, of your own initiative, revise that disclosure historically, or you can wait till the mandatory reporting requirements come into effect and we'll do it for you. So I think the point there is, yes, certainly transparency, but I think, you need to take a bit of a measured approach, and that'll be very different depending on the organization and the maturity level, I guess you would say, of the systems and processes you use for collecting ESG type data.
So obviously that's with respect to the public companies and the public disclosure. Are you seeing this trickling down into the privates in the early stage, or is that, because that's going to seem to me somewhat onerous? You're not of events any size where you actually have that capability of doing all this. You have, I think to say, two team members in a pickup truck, and how do you do all of this?
Yeah, one person's driving the pickup truck, the other one's taking notes. But no, in all seriousness, you raise a good point. Yeah, I was describing mainly publicly listed companies, but greenwashing can happen in a variety of forums, right? And it can attract liability, well beyond what you're required to report from a mandatory reporting perspective. A few examples. When we see smaller companies that are responding to, for example, requests for proposals, right? The things that are committed to within those RFPs can often not have, the oversight of the board, nor have a good connection to credible and reliable data. So we have seen examples where, RFPs contain misleading information, and there's different forms of liability there as well, right? Like if you, for example, win a sizable contract on the basis that you're doing X, Y, and Z from an ESG perspective, and somewhere down the road something goes wrong, and it turns out that those things were not actually being done, that's a thread to pull on from a litigation perspective. So and this is fairly far into the future. I'm not saying this is happening tomorrow, and I don't want to be a dramatic and sensational doomsday naysayer, but we do point that out to companies just to highlight the fact that, yeah, you need to be very conscious of where disclosures are being made, whether you're a public company or not.
Jennifer, you said something earlier about how you evaluate loan applications, and I want to dig in a little bit more, because you're now going to have a customer. How do they know that they're not disadvantaged by coming to you vis-a-vis going to another financial institution? If the playing field's not level, that can create a real challenge for somebody where they want to deal with you. They want to deal with an organization that supports the initiatives that you're doing, but they may, in their process of wanting to work with you, their business may not totally fit yours, and so they're then potentially disadvantaged, and then maybe they have to go someplace else. Are you seeing that as a problem and a risk from that side?
No, I wouldn't say we would see that as a problem. I think it's more of an opportunity for us to influence other businesses and how they operate. And so the fact that we want to work with people who are highly values aligned it's an important cornerstone of our business. And it opens a door for us to talk to those organizations about their practices and what could potentially make a deal workable for us. And I think every organization, I think, is starting to look at this now and starting to say, okay, in what way could we incorporate ESG? And so if partnering with a bank like BCIB helps them discover ways to retrofit their building while they're refinancing their loan, or incorporate some, green features on their new construction build. These are all things that we think we can help influence for those clients who are really interested in working with us. So it's a great opportunity for us to even, expand on that impact that we're having, because we feel like we're influencing some of the potential decisions that these borrowers are taking.
And continuing on that path, Connor, are you seeing ESG being a factor for companies as they're raising capital of being able to attract investors? And is that broad-based, or is it just those investors that are social impact investors? What are you seeing?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I mean, we talk to clients often, and it depends on the industry, certainly, but the way we describe it is the horse has left the barn, basically. All levels of investors are requiring, ESG information in some capacity or another. That includes institutional, retail, down to the individual investor. I mean, there's tons of research out there that'll tell you that. But I mean, the proof is also in the pudding. When Jennifer was talking about values aligned organizations, like I'll give you a good example, maybe just to demonstrate how far that actually goes. I mean, we're a law firm and we're a service provider, right? But we get these sorts of requests all the time from our own clients, from counterparties, from students that are looking to come work with us, right? They're asking, what are you doing from an ESG perspective? So I think virtually every organization that we talk to, I don't think that there's one where I would give them the advice, oh, you don't need to worry about ESG and you don't need to be doing anything about it. I think, we're in a place where it's pervasive. And again, regardless of politics, maybe I'll touch on this very quickly. In the US, there is an anti-ESG movement, let's call it that. But the way we describe that and kind of characterize it is, it feels similar to me post Enron, when you had Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which required a extra level of diligence and reporting relative to financial metrics. I think it's going to be much the same. The rest of the developed world has already moved rapidly and is squarely in the space where non-financial criteria by way of ESG is just the way we do business now. So I don't see any scenario in the future where that won't be the case here in Canada.
So in that, maybe you can touch on, are you seeing boards being trained, and maybe we'll start with Jennifer. Is your board actually been trained in this? To what are they looking for, and how are they making sure that they're providing that oversight?
Yeah, absolutely. Our board continues to take advantage of training opportunities. It's certainly an incredibly important part of our board composition that we're excelling in the governance aspect. And so making sure that we've got strong board diversity, looking at things like gender, race, age, experience, diversity, having, independence on the board committees, and really board accountability is very important. So in order to achieve that accountability, that does take up a fair amount of training to make sure that board members are comfortable with that accountability, to make sure that they are providing the right level of oversight to the results that we're putting out there. So it is certainly an important continuing education part of our board.
Connor, from a legal perspective, are you seeing that boards are getting more trained in this area? Is it been a topic that's becoming more front and center?
It takes up approximately 10 hours of my day at the moment. So if that gives you any indication as to how important it is and where the requests are coming from, the answer is, yeah, it's an overwhelming yes. And I think that's partially a function of, the things that we've already talked about in terms of how investing, lending, insurance decisions are being made on this basis. We have mandatory reporting requirements coming in, but there's a few pieces of that legislation that again have those personal liability components. So a good way to get a director's attention is to tell them, hey, you need to know about this stuff. By the way, you're responsible for it, and if things go sideways, you're ultimately on the hook for it. So we've been doing a ton of that. As I say, the modern slavery legislation is coming into effect here January 1st next year. So a great deal of our time has been spent training boards up on that as well. And even beyond that, just getting companies prepared for whether you're a public company or whether you're a private company trying to attract capital. Your board needs to be aware of these things because it does influence, much more than just your reporting. Jennifer talked about it earlier. It impacts your entire strategy going forward. So if you're doing a good job as a director, I think training on ESG is absolutely imperative.
So Jennifer, have you seen, or you must have in place a framework for that reporting? And where do you, like companies that are not familiar with this, and I'm putting it out to both of you, where do you actually get educated to actually where to start on this to know what you need to be doing? Jen, do you want to start on that one?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, it would be great to put together some resources, for companies to look at. Where the Vancity Group uses a guide to applying ethical principles for business relationships. So that's an internal guide that helps us ensure that all the projects and organizations we align with also align with our values and mission. And so it provides sort of a guide for the degree to which a loan, for example, might facilitate emissions reductions or provide benefits to different communities. That this is sort of lays out our impact guidelines and how an application can proceed. So that's, an internal guide that was set up for us. We track and analyze everything against that. And then it's tracked and reported in our financial results in our annual report. So I would say, absolutely, Vancity on the website has a lot of good resources for how these principles are applied. So that could be a resource. And in terms of external ones, I think that's a great idea to compile some resources, and I'd be happy to send some of those over for you to share with your members.
That would be great. Connor, are you seeing, you must be seeing this request for having those frameworks for how to actually be in compliance with this and how you do the reporting. Have you seen things like that?
Yeah, we certainly see those requests from our clients, and there are a variety of resources out there. The one caveat I would make there, though, is oftentimes the resources that you see were built in that voluntary regime. So, a lot of it's good directionally, like it's taking the right trajectory, certainly, but very self-serving and maybe slightly promotional. There's always, I think, a place for a legal lens in this world as we move towards that mandatory side of things. But there are a number of good resources out there too. And I'm just scanning some of the questions here in terms of asking how do you get started. I think one of the important aspects is to try and find an industry leader. So, for instance, if you're in the financial services industry, we often give the advice: take a look at Vancity, see what they're doing. They have lots of information that's publicly available, and maybe it's not set up directly as a how-to guide, but if you read through the materials that they have, it gives you a lot of insight into how they're approaching these very important topics. And usually that'll serve as a pretty good starting point for any organization.
Right. I'm kind of thinking about, so we didn't really touch on right at the beginning about the certification process. Who actually is responsible for that certification? Connor, do you know that?
I'll maybe leave that one for Jennifer.
Yeah, I believe it's a choice to become certified B-corp. And so I do know that when you go through the certification process and have to recertify every 3 years, they're really assessing a range of factors. They're looking at your environmental footprint, your social responsibility, and your overall impact on community. So they're looking at things like energy efficiency, employee well-being, And they're really operating on a scoring methodology. And so, for example, when we first became certified, when we came to recertification 3 years later, in 2022, we achieved a much higher impact score. So we were up 53% from our first score. And so that really was attributed to us growing our impact lending portfolio in a very focused way, specifically in really focusing on supporting more underserved communities and more climate-friendly, climate-forward projects. And so really it's a scoring methodology that the B Corp certification process puts you through.
What were, this goes back a ways because you've been in this journey for quite some time. What were mistakes that you saw when you were going down this path? And I'm going to be interested in Connor's viewpoints as well from a more general perspective. But Jennifer, when you were doing this, did you actually make mistakes as you were going through this certification process that you had potentially unintended consequences to certain things that you did that you didn't actually think about?
Well, there's a small caveat that I wasn't with the organization when it first became a B Corp. But I would say that I think, at the core of it is really that accurate data measurement. And so having the ability to have really accurate data and consistent measurement would really be vital to making sure that not only are you hitting the impact goals that you've set for your own organization, but it also becomes really integral to certifying and being able to improve that B Corp score every time you're recertified. So I'd say that's what I would assume would be where companies could potentially encounter errors, is really in around that data measurement piece, because that is complex and it's critically important to improving your score.
And Connor, have you seen negative impacts on companies by going down this process?
I wouldn't say necessarily negative. There's a number of different certifications out there. B Corp is probably the most prominent in Canada anyway at the moment, but there's a number of other certifications that are, for example, industry specific. And I guess the one challenge that we've heard from clients when they're embarking on such a journey is maybe twofold. One is, the volume of data and information that's actually required. I think you need to go into those things eyes wide open, and then a corresponding potential impact, again, not negative necessarily, but something to consider is, what kind of resources are you going to dedicate, to those sorts of efforts? And then on the final side of things, really thinking about, what is it that you're trying to get out of this? Because, again, back to earlier comments in terms of, that whole promotional landscape. If you're doing it for promotional reasons, it's probably not a good idea, but if you are really trying to get, to that values aligned position, and certainly there's corresponding, financial positive aspects there as well, but, really thinking about why it is that you're going down any sort of certification journey.
Okay. Jennifer, from Vanziti's perspective, where do you see this going? So obviously that you've been on this journey, you're where you are today. There is going to be, this is not the end by any means. It's continuing, and when you see how many assets under management we're seeing on just in the U.S., that's significant. So, where do you see this ESG and B Corps going in the future, and what should people be keeping an eye out on?
Yeah, and as I said earlier, Vancity's been doing it for a long time, and it's really the key for us is just that it's become a core values for us, not for the promotional aspect of it, but it's just how we do business day in and day out. So it's absolutely core to our business model, and so I think that's the best advice I would give to any company that wants to show up authentically as a ESG focused or a certified B Corp type business is really stay true to that core value. Really identify that is a core value for your organization. And then it just becomes completely embedded in how you interact with your clients. how you work with them to close transactions. And really, is it, for us as a bank, we have certain tools available to us in our day-to-day business. And part of it is, doing things that we believe are right, that align with the values, and using those tools that we have at our fingertips as a bank to be able to achieve those values. And so if there's ways we can influence other companies, support the companies that maybe are underserved in other traditional financial institutions, that's where we show up, and that core value comes through. And so, I think going forward, more and more companies absolutely will have to pivot towards that full, values proposition where it's part of their day-to-day. And we're already there and proving that you can do that and still turn a profit, still make a good business, a strong business, but have that core value every day in every business decision that we take.
Thanks. Connor, where do you see this going? Obviously, it's on a journey. So and we're now seeing, as you saw, new legislation coming in place. That's not the only piece that's ever going to be coming in. Where do you think you're going to see this going? And what should companies be aware of to keep an eye out?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, it all comes back to those mandatory drivers, whether directly or indirectly. As I say, there's a number of mandatory pieces of legislation that are coming into effect that have a direct impact on, let's call them, generally speaking, larger organizations. But the impact of those, I think, are going to be felt, across industries and up and down value chains. So I don't think there's any avoiding it. I think it's a matter of staying up to speed and informed. Which isn't that easy. Maybe an admission against self-interest, but at least once a week I find myself in a meeting where someone raises a question or an issue that I have never heard of, right? So it just happens all the time. So I think it's maybe an appreciation for organizations that it's impossible, I think, for you to know everything, but certainly there is no going back, as I said before. And I think it's a matter of getting your leadership team and your board, if you have one, aligned on these things, and then setting yourself up. And this probably is pretty relevant from a clean tech perspective and a startup perspective, as well as you don't need to build the gold-plated standard right out of the gates. But I think it is important as you start any sort of enterprise that you are thinking about these things, and you're at least making space from a future and forward-looking perspective to incorporate them as the requirements and regulations evolve.
So it sounds like ignoring this, like if I were to take a look at how we put it, that there's what would be a fatal flaw from a management and a board perspective. Ignoring this area is likely to your own detriment if you're not aware, if you're not putting in place positions and knowing how to manage towards it. You don't have to be getting it all right at the beginning. But are there any pieces of advice in this journey where you can say, this is a fatal flaw, don't do it. This is something that I want to make sure that you take away from this in this area. Connor, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I'll just go very quickly, and then we're actually getting evacuated, so I need to go here in a minute. But the one fatal flaw, and I hear this all the time, is don't fall into the trap of this is the way it's always been done. We're into a new world, I think, and a new dynamic, which requires particularly boards of directors and leadership teams to think in a very different way, I think, than many have over the years. So it's just being open to these requirements and the recognition that they're not going away. So ignorance is not bliss in this case. It's a real opportunity, I think, for education, and ultimately I think that will translate into both financial and non-financial benefits for virtually every organization. But I do have to sign off because we're getting back.
Thank you, Connor. Thank you for joining us. We're going to wrap it up, but I appreciate joining us. Be safe.
Okay.
Jennifer, we'll turn it over to you on that regard.
Thanks so much.
Sure. Yeah, I'd say, it's not something to take lightly. So I would say there's lots of planning to be done before you jump into that kind of decision. And of course, every business is very different. I think, if you're considering becoming a B Corp, you should really think about the fact that you really have to commit to making impact really core to the way you work. Maybe look at your company, think about how do you contribute to your community? Are there other ways that you could contribute that are new? And what in your core business are you good at, and what kind of levers do you have? So, at Van City, we use the tools of finance to do good. What can your business do to help your community, and make sure that you have that commitment in place, because it's not really something you kind of jump into halfway. You really have to commit to it.
Well, thanks, Jen. Nisha, given that this is the first for us where we've lost one of the panelists to a fire drill, I think we're coming to the end in any event. So I want to thank Connor. Nisha, I'll turn it over to you and make sure the audience knows that they can reach out to both Jen and to Connor if they have any further questions.
Thank you, James. And this was a great session. And thank you to our panel members too. We have our next Fireside chat session on December 14th. The topic is M&A, Insights, Trends, and Strategies. So please join us on December 14th. And this session is recorded, and we'll be sending the recording soon. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Bye. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.